Hello, everybody. How you doing? Welcome back to session 13, Factors Affecting Stimulus Control. You have to pardon me. I think I've got hat head here. I just came back in. It's December 31st. We just had our big first snowstorm, and I just finished doing some shoveling outside and talking about stimulus control. I've been waiting all morning to do this, but as I kept looking out the window in between sessions, I see that it's still snowing. So there's the stimulus control. Actually, it's just a really good excuse not to go outside and do shoveling, which I really don't like to do. I don't have the best of backs. So now I have no excuses. I went out, shoveled, and I'm back, and I've got hat head. So bear with me. All right, let's get started, shall we? Let's freeze the camera here. Okay, and let's go ahead and get my arrow and get the full screen here. And we're ready to rock and roll. All right, so first experiment we're going to talk about was done by George Reynolds in 1961, where we're going to talk about behavioral contrast. Now, at this point, I'm going to assume that you guys know enough about your schedules of reinforcement because we're going to go into some of the more compound schedules and complex schedule arrangements. And in this experiment, in the first phase, this multiple schedule involved training a pigeon to peck a key, and this pigeon was reinforced according to a variable interval 3 minutes. Okay, and under a VI 3 minutes, it says that on the average, the first response that occurs after 3 minutes gets food. So you shape this response up, and we have the key color light being red, which would signal that it's a VI3. And then occasionally we would go back and forth between a red key light and a green key light, and the green key light is also a VI 3 minutes. So what this kind of shows you is that both red light and green light indicate that a VI 3 minute schedule of reinforcement for food is in effect. And because in these two conditions it doesn't matter, the frequency of reinforcement in this condition and that condition are the same. And therefore, what we would expect to see are equal rates of responding in both of these components. I'm going to switch you over to the graph to show you that that's in fact what happens. Here we're looking on the y-axis, responses per minute, and we see the responding to the red key, VI3, which is the closed circle, and the open circle is responding to green. And you could see over the first 5 sessions under these conditions going back and forth, you have equal rates of responding in red and green, which is exactly what you would expect under this set of conditions. In phase 2, Reynolds kept the VI3 in place for the red key light, but when the green light key light came on, no food. In other words, green now was correlated with extinction. And what you see happening here, which should be no surprise, is every time the green key light comes on, you see the open circle, less responding, less responding, less responding. In other words, in the presence of a green key, which is S delta, and its extinction, you see a decrease in the rate of response. So this should be no surprise to you here. But what is a surprise is that when it comes back to red, which is VI3, response rate actually goes up. And the reason why this is surprising is because there should be no reason for response rate to go up, because remember when we talk about schedules of reinforcement, these do not necessarily lead, these fast responses do not lead to reinforcement any faster. Why? Because it's going to come on the average every 3 minutes. So when we come back and look at this contingency of reinforcement here, responding faster on an interval schedule does not bring food around any faster. Now that would make sense if we were talking about fixed ratio, because on a ratio schedule, the faster you respond, the faster you get food. And here, you could just simply look at this and say, you see this? No food over here. They're just going to respond faster over here because the faster they respond, they get food. And that's just not the case. They're still stuck with a VI 3 minutes. And in other words, the frequency of reinforcement has not changed in this condition over here. Yet you get an increase in the rate of responding anyway. This is called positive behavioral contrast. This happens when we see an increased rate of responding in an unchanged condition. And that's what we're actually seeing right here. We're seeing an increase in the rate of responding in this condition, but this was an unchanged condition. It was the same thing that was happening over here. Okay? Now, in the third phase of this experiment, I just jumped past it, Reynolds went ahead and reinstated green key light to bring VI3 again. In other words, we just went back to the A condition, right? Phase A, phase B, go back and replicate phase A, in which we have the frequency of reinforcement essentially the same between these two conditions. And what we see actually happening is that all of a sudden green key light comes on, things are good in presence of green, it comes back up, almost to the original levels as it was before. Phase A, phase B, right? The effect of A, B, and now we replicate A. These green, green is a good place again. And now, look what happens in red. Rate comes down, even though the frequency of reinforcement has not changed. We call that negative contrast, because we're so clever as behavior analysts. Now, actually, it's negative contrast in which we see a decrease in the rate of responding in the unchanged component. Okay? And that's what we're seeing here. Change in the unchanged component, it comes down. And again, even though we're talking about pigeons, the human analog is just the same sort of a thing. Over here, we might say that the closed circle, red, might be my behavior of going shopping at Safeway. Open circle is green, which is my behavior of shopping at King Soopers. And I shop at these places, just the same. The prices are the same. The frequency of reinforcement is the same. Not much real difference between the two places for the most part. But then over in the Lafayette area, which is where I usually go shopping, King Soopers, which is the open circle, was actually undergoing all kinds of renovations. And whenever I go there to try to find food, I go to one part of the store and find out, no, it's not over here, it's on the other side of the store, because they were completely redoing everything. In other words, stimulus control was just completely shot to hell. And usually what usually takes me 15 to 20 minutes to shop, I'm schlepping around the store trying to find the right object, and I can't find it anywhere. I can tell you very quickly, King Soopers is not a very fun place to shop under these conditions because, again, stimulus control is breaking down, my behavior is undergoing extinction, but not necessarily extinction, but certainly the rate of reinforcement is going down because of a change in stimulus control. So therefore, I am spending a lot less time going to King Soopers. Consequently, I start spending more time going to Safeway. Now, somebody who watches my behavior at Safeway and says, boy, Kupfer comes here a whole heck of a lot more, he must actually like Safeway much better than King Soopers. Yet liking it has really nothing to do with it. This condition changed over here. If this condition had not changed, my behavior here wouldn't have changed. And it would have been erroneous to some degree for them to say that it's more reinforced to come over here. It's just simply a change of stimulus control conditions in which I have easier time at Safeway. And then all of a sudden, they see my behavior at Safeway drop off. Why? Because King Soopers finally opened up, everything is renovated, everything is back to normal. Okay? We oftentimes will see the same sort of type of behavioral contrast happen, and I really want to point this out because I have seen this happen in many times over the years that I've done behavioral programming in which the consumer I'm working with is in two or more locations, and we're implementing a behavior plan in one setting but not in another setting. And we might have a situation where we implement a behavior plan in both settings, right? Reinforcement is the same in both settings. Behavior plan is working really well. The consumer's behavior is working great. And then in one setting, all of a sudden, let's say it's the home setting, they decide to triple the amount of reinforcement given for the same behavior that they were getting over here. And all of a sudden, reinforcement increases over here. You see an increase in the rate of responding here. You may all of a sudden see a drop-off in the performance in the other setting. That may be the day program. Okay? And it's really important that we discuss this because whenever you're going to make a behavior plan change, you really need to make sure everybody across all settings know this is happening. If we went ahead and made a change in the behavior plan and all of a sudden performance improves in the home setting, it may deteriorate in the other setting even though nothing is different in the day program, all of a sudden the rate of effective responding is going further down, further down, further down, and so forth. And the people in the day program start saying, what in the world's going on with this individual? They're decompensating. Something's up with them. Maybe somebody's not running the plan right, and now you start running a witch hunt and start looking at every one of your behavior plans, all change your behavior plan, and surely it's not a change on our part, therefore there's something happening with the client. And this is going to happen, by the way, not because of something that's wrong with the day program, but because something else changed in their environment. Okay? Now, one of the things I want to point out here is that behavioral contrast tends to be somewhat of a transient effect. That is, if we had let this run out a little bit longer in this pigeon experiment, look what started happening here. The behavior went up, the contrast effect happened over here, but it was already starting to possibly come down. And we find out that when you get these behavioral contrast effects, sometimes if you run the sessions out longer, it will eventually wash away. But it's really during these initial changes that really become very problematic. This is why transitions are so important. Important events that are happening in a person's life that affect them in one set of circumstances will affect them in other circumstances. We know this happens personally to us when we're reinforced in the presence of one setting, and when reinforcers go down in one setting, we're just going to spend more time and gravitate to another situation where there's more reinforcement. Okay? All right. This again is a what we call a byproduct of stimulus control that I wanted to alert you to, and it's certainly talked about in the Pearson-Cheney book. Another phenomenon that happens as a byproduct of stimulus control is something called peak shift. Now I'm going to describe this experiment by Hansen, in which he started off during baseline conditions. He shaped up key pecking in the presence of a green key light, which is approximately 550 nanometers. And the first response on the average, after 1 minute, produces food. That's in the presence of a green light. Whenever the key light went dark, extinction's in place. So here we have the perfect ingredient, by the way, for discrimination training. Remember, in order to shape up a discrimination, behavior must be reinforced in the presence of one stimulus, and extinction in the presence of another stimulus. And when you do this, you will establish a sharp degree of stimulus control in the presence of green. And if you don't believe me, there you see it. Right there, here's your generalization training after the SD, doing the SD only right here. Okay? Do the SD training. Okay? Stimulus control training. Then what Hansen did was to change the condition so that, again, VI 1 minute was in the presence of a green key light, but now, instead of extinction being on the dark key, he made a blue key the extinction. Okay? And what happens is that the generalization gradient peak actually shifts in a direction away from green. In other words, whereas you had nice stimulus control under this training condition, now it's shifted away. Let me show you what happens when you do this kind of training. You see the peak? It's shifted away. In other words, the SD was right here. Now, instead of being a dark key, which is over here, it's a blue key. Blue key is right about here at about 570 nanometers. So now this becomes extinction, or S delta, and instead of the peak being over here, it's now shifted in a direction away. That's called peak shift. And we describe the peak shift phenomenon as a situation that happens when there's a shift in the peak of the generalization gradient in a direction away from the stimulus presented during extinction. Okay? Now, it stands to reason, let's see what would happen here. If we didn't use 570 to use a blue key, the peak would be here. What would happen, do you think, if we actually made the S delta right over here, which would be somewhere in the neighborhood of about orange or yellowish, right about this area here. In this situation, if you make the S delta here, you guessed it, this peak would be over here. Why? Because again, we shift the peak in a direction away from S delta. This is a very fancy experimental way of saying we tend to shy away from things which are extinction. We don't like having extinction in our environment because there's no reinforcers there. So we oftentimes will shift away from conditions of extinction to place ourselves in conditions which are much more favorable for reinforcement. And that's exactly what's actually happening over here. Now, it's important to point out here that in at least this experiment, peak shift only occurs when its intra-dimensional stimuli are used for stimuli and they're present during reinforcement extinction. In other words, if I used reinforcement as a light but used extinction, I used an auditory tone, this wouldn't work. I would not get peak shift. In other words, let me go back here. It must be in the same dimension. I must be talking about SDs and S deltas all within a visual range which are called wavelengths. I can't have an SD being a color and the S delta being an auditory sound. It must be in the same dimension. And by the way, this would obviously work if I was working with 1,000 hertz tone here, and all of a sudden I made the S delta, instead of 1,000 hertz tone, I made it a 15,000 hertz tone. All of a sudden it would shift in this dimension. Why? Because it's in the same dimension. When they're not in the same dimension, we call that being an interdimensional, not interdimensional. And it just simply, you will not get peak shift effect. Okay, and we are done with byproducts of stimulus control. Not bad. And when you guys return for the next session, we will be talking about a procedure called errorless discrimination. It's actually one of my favorite experimental procedures to describe, and it's one of the ones that I really hope you'll find extremely useful when you're actually shaping up a discrimination, no matter what you're working on with an individual, particularly with kids. This is very important, the next session that we'll be talking about this procedure. Until then, I will talk to you folks later. Be seeing you.